It has been more than 1,000 days since the war began in Ukraine, and it has been more than 10 years since Russia's attacks on Ukraine began. During this time, we've seen offensives, counter-offensives, threats, changes of plans, and above all, hundreds of thousands of casualties and untold amounts of destruction. We have seen how once again, in the middle of Europe, many towns and cities have been turned to ash. Nevertheless, now, with the imminent arrival of Donald Trump to the White House, it seems that everything may change. You've all heard it. The new president-elect is committed to stopping this war. But in the meantime, probably in coordination with Trump himself, President Biden has lifted several vetoes to improve Ukraine's negotiating position. I'm talking, of course, about the use of Western missiles to attack targets inside Russia, as well as the massive delivery of anti-personnel mines. And as you can imagine, Russia has not stood idly by. In recent months, we've seen their hybrid warfare campaign against the old continent intensify. We've seen how along the borders with Russia and Belarus of neighboring countries like Finland, Poland, and Lithuania, there are periodic waves of illegal immigration. We've seen Chinese cargo ships, allegedly by mistake, damage gas connections between Estonia and Finland, or attack important communication cables in the Baltic Sea. And of course, we've seen tons of propaganda everywhere. But at the end of the day, none of this is what is of most concern in the West. Most disturbing has been Vladimir Putin's own direct response to Biden's decision to give the Ukrainians the green light to use ATACMS missiles against targets inside Russia. I'm referring, of course, to the launch on 21st of November of an intermediate-range ballistic missile against a military factory in the city of Dnipro, Ukraine. The missile reached, according to Ukrainian military intelligence, a speed of almost Mach 11, about 13,440 kilometers an hour, or 8,351 miles an hour. It took a total of 15 minutes to travel the 800 kilometers from the launch site to the target. Putin himself said it was a test of his latest Oreshnik missile.
В боевых условиях было проведено в том числе и испытание одной из новейших российских ракетных систем средней дальности. В данном случае с баллистической ракетой в безъядерном гиперзвуковом оснащении. Наши ракетчики назвали ее Oreshnik.
And not only that, the day after making this announcement, Putin himself confirmed that he would immediately begin regular production of this new missile. Although new, it's not clear that it's so new either.
I would be extremely surprised if this missile system had more than 10% new parts.
According to the Pentagon and many military experts, the Oreshnik missile is basically a development of the RS-26 Rubens, a type of missile already successfully tested in 2012, with a range of about 5,800 kilometers to 6,000 kilometers. That's over 3,600 miles.
I think they basically disassembled an RS-26, cannibalized it, and then put together this new missile with a couple of upgrades and a fresh coat of paint.
Whatever the case, we're talking about a type of missile with low precision, high cost, and that hardly caused any damage to the former Soviet Union's secret missile and rocket factory against which it was launched. The Russians did not want to load it properly. And yet, despite everything, this was not just another launch. This time, many alarm bells went off in the West. Basically because we're talking about a missile that is difficult to stop, designed to be equipped with nuclear warheads, and that could reach practically any target in Europe in the blink of an eye. What's more, this is compounded by the fact that a few weeks ago, Russia changed its nuclear doctrine to expand the cases in which Moscow could resort to these types of weapons. Specifically, the new doctrine states that nuclear weapons may be used when Russia is attacked by Western weapons with Western assistance, which is exactly what Putin himself says was what happened when Ukraine began using both American ATACMS and British Storm Shadow and French Scalp missiles to blow up military targets inside Russian territory.
С этого момента, как мы неоднократно подчеркивали, ранее спровоцированный Западом региональный конфликт на Украине приобрел элементы глобального характера.
In other words, we're talking about a kind of political offensive of threats and warnings, which is what is truly concerning. And it's right at this point that a heated debate arises. There are those who think that this is the latest bluster from the Russian tyrant, and those who believe that this time it's a warning. A message that goes something like, this time we have not unleashed the nuclear storm, but we're preparing the tools and equipment to be able to do so in the future. So don't push your luck. Even so, this is not the first time Putin has threatened to use nuclear weapons. In fact, it has already become almost commonplace during the war, and many experts already take it half-jokingly.
In my opinion, this is another deception and a demonstration of Putin's weakness. He does not dare to use nuclear weapons because that would make him a total pariah. This is a psychological PR operation of the Kremlin without much substance. Its purpose is to scare the leaders and voters of countries that support Ukraine.
The United States itself says the risk is very low. And of course, Putin's own appearance, tired and haggard, does not project the appearance of a leader who has the upper hand. I don't know, he was supposed to be happy about Trump's victory, North Korean reinforcements, recent advances by the Russian military, and the foreseeable end of the war in Ukraine. And yet, he seems nothing of the sort. But why then has this missile provoked so much debate and so much controversy? What can it mean just at a time when the war seems to be entering its home stretch? Why doesn't Putin seem to be as cheerful as he's supposed to be? Well, that's exactly what we're going to look at in this video. And I can already tell you that with what we're going to see coming up, we will be able to better understand many of Moscow's recent moves.
The fury of the bear.
So, why did Putin use intermediate-range ballistic missiles to attack an industrial plant in Ukraine? Well, the first explanation seems simple. To respond to the green light that Biden gave Ukraine to use ATACMS against targets in Russia. With this response, the Russian president would be seeking to send a warning message to the West. Don't go too far. We are reaching our limit of patience. Do not give Ukraine any more advanced weapons. This VisualPolitik community is the explanation that has been repeated in practically all the media outlets. However, in this case, the story is a bit more complicated. Putin seized the moment, but the truth is that the launch had more objectives. Among other reasons, because the use of the ATACMS, or the UK's Storm Shadow, or France's Scalp, is hardly going to change the course of the war at this point. Yes, it was a response to Biden's green light, but there was more to it. Here, we're playing a slightly more complex game, where moves are anticipated many moves in advance. There are some of the things that Russian propagandists never take into account. At the latest NATO summit held in Washington last July, the United States announced an important decision: drastically increase its deterrence and long-range firepower capabilities in the heart of Europe. Specifically, we're talking about the United States deploying a large collection of advanced ground-launched weapons in Germany and other European countries. We talked about the SM-6 multi-purpose missile, the Tomahawk cruise missile, the future Dark Eagle and Operational Fire's hypersonic weapons that are in the final stages of development, and also some new types of short-range ballistic missiles. This would greatly increase the reach of US forces in Europe, which would now have Russia at a stone's throw, thus returning to the old days of the Cold War. Keep in mind that under the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty signed by Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan in 1987, the two countries were prohibited from deploying some of the types of missiles that the United States has now decided to place back in Europe.
At that time, they were banned by mutual agreement because of the enormous risk they posed. Remember that if one of these missiles were fired, the window for reaction from the adversary would be extremely short, so there would be no time for practically anything. The risk was very high. However, in 2019, Donald Trump abandoned this treaty because, according to his administration, Putin's Russia was breaching it by developing some types of banned cruise missiles.
Well, given that this is the new scenario that Moscow is facing, this has been an opportunity to say, watch out, because we're also working on improving and increasing the deployment of these capabilities. In other words, that a response in the form of a demonstration was expected from Russia, and that is what has now happened. Of course, this is not the only objective or significance of this launch. No matter the casualties or the costs, what is certain is that after the failure of the initial offensive, Russia has more or less withstood well both the onslaught of the war and the economic sanctions.
Наши войска успешно наступают по всей линии боевого соприкосновения. Все задачи, которые мы перед собой ставим, будут решены.
Even so, this doesn't mean that things are fine. Russia's military industry has grown to a point where, in terms of resources, manpower, and technology, it can hardly provide more. And yet, it's not enough. Ukraine's arms consumption continues to outstrip Russia's ability to replenish those losses. That is causing their arsenals to begin to be severely strained. If today the Russians are managing to maintain their war effort, it's thanks to the enormous help received from their new North Korean buddies. And I'm not talking about the 11,000 soldiers deployed in Kursk, but about the millions of artillery shells they have been given.
For example, it is estimated that half of all projectiles being used by Russia already come from North Korean stockpiles, something that has allowed the Kremlin to push forward its ongoing offensives. And even so, experts point out that in the second half of 2025, Russia could face a serious shortage of this unpredictable ammunition.
And that's not all. According to existing estimates, Russia could be losing on average 100 tanks and 220 artillery pieces per month. So what's the problem with that? Well, the Russian industrial capacity is limited to only 20 units of this equipment per month. In other words, every month, Russia loses about 320 guns and can only manufacture 20. And why can it only manufacture 20? Well, because the manufacture of cannons for tanks or artillery by its very nature requires the use of large and advanced rotary forges, gigantic industrial machines that compress and mold the steel or other metals used in production through a combination of extreme pressure and continuous rotation. This makes it possible to obtain solid, long, hollow parts with enormous resistance to high pressure and high heat conditions. Put another way, cannons for tanks or artillery. So what's the problem there? Well, Russia only has 2 rotary forges with a production capacity of about 10 guns per month. Why don't they use more? Well, basically because the Russians don't have the capacity to manufacture their own rotary forges. There are very few companies in the world that can supply this capacity, and at the moment, Russia has no access to any of them. So its production capacity is limited. It can try to refurbish old tanks, but when it comes to manufacturing new equipment, the limit is clear. And if we're talking about combat vehicles, it's a very similar story. The data say that since the war began, Russia has lost almost 5,000 vehicles, about 155 per month, while its production capacity is barely 200 per year. So it's clear, as its arsenals become exhausted, the Kremlin may begin to have more and more problems. And that's not all. The war already consumes most of Russia's budget, leaving few resources for other types of spending. And if we add to this the fact that between the dead, wounded, and mutilated, casualties could already be amounting to about 700,000 troops, according to British intelligence, which is obviously a waste of resources. Even more so when, right now, Russia has 575,000 soldiers fighting in Ukraine and expects to increase this figure to 690,000. This is an enormous consumption of resources. And what does all this have to do with the missile? Well, Russia also needs the war to end, or at least for no new large arms deliveries to be made to Ukraine. In this way, the missile launch is a way to put pressure now that the US government is in its transition. A way to tell the new administration, hey, take your campaign words seriously, we are getting fed up, and things could escalate. Let's just say it's time to raise the pressure as much as they can to speed up the talks, and at the same time, improve their negotiating position. In fact, that's the same thing they're doing in Kursk, where for weeks now, the Russians have been stepping up their game to try to regain as much ground as possible, as quickly as possible, to the point that the intensity of the battles has been at one of its highest points in the entire war, perhaps only comparable to the Bakhmut offensive.
They are storming all the time, in the morning, in the daytime, at night.
By now, Ukraine has already lost more than 40% of the territory it came to control in Kursk in August, and Russian pressure continues. It's now or never. Either it's better to win it on the front line, or to have to buy it back at the negotiating table. What's more, we cannot forget that the missile launch and the threat it carries have also given Trump's team a bargaining chip for arguing the need to end the war, whatever it takes. It's the same thing in a way that they're doing with nuclear power plants. The attacks on power facilities are not only aimed at making Ukrainians freeze to death, but also at playing with nuclear safety. How do they do it? Well, see for yourselves.
Ukrainian nuclear power plants need the power grid both to transmit the electricity they produce and to receive power for the reactor's cooling and safety systems. And if these grids or the supply goes down, then all security depends on unreliable diesel generators, which of course puts a lot of pressure on European governments, even if they don't talk about it much.
Yes, this is the Russian way, a state that has surpassed all levels of recklessness, irresponsibility, and lack of humanity. But speaking of peace, this brings us directly to Russia's third concern, because peace might not be entirely good for its interests. What am I talking about? Well, listen up. Russia wants to end the war and keep the gains it has made. In a way, that would be a victory for Putin. And of course, Trump may be his best asset in this. Nevertheless, there are those in Washington who are considering a sort of Korean-style exit. We'll be talking about this alternative in detail soon on VisualPolitik, so if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time to do so, in order not to miss that video. But for now, let me tell you that this would involve freezing the front lines, where they are, and delivering a huge amount of advanced weapons to Ukraine, enough to deter any Russian attempt to re-enter the country. country. What does this mean? Well, two things. That Ukraine would be a hostile country armed to the teeth and would also come completely under Western influence. And that's something that Russia is not happy about. Because if that came to pass, basically what they would have done with the war is that they would have cornered themselves. And what's even worse for Russian nationalism, to be on a par with Ukraine would be a kind of historical humiliation. And there's more. Even today, we can find news items like this.
War in Ukraine. European military deployment under discussion.
Well, this would still be a terribly uncomfortable exit for Moscow. Something of a Pyrrhic victory. A victory in the short term, but a foreseeable defeat over time. And that's why they now have to turn up for pressure, so that this option is ruled out in a negotiation. To rule out the West arming Ukraine to the teeth over the next few years. Don't forget that one of the demands Russia made at the failed 2022 peace talks was to limit the size and capacity of the Ukrainian military. Which brings us directly to a fourth point. Pay attention to this story from the Wall Street Journal.
Ukraine is firing Western-made ballistic missiles and starting to build its own.
Following the green light from Washington, Paris, and London, Ukraine is starting to use its precision missiles to attack targets in Russia. But that capability is limited. Not only due to the restrictions that still exist, but also because Ukraine doesn't have that many such missiles. That's why Kyiv claims to have its own ballistic missile program, a secret program which, they say, will soon yield results.
You will hear next year, or by the end of the year, that there will be a big missile program. Believe me, soon there will be concrete results that not only Ukraine, but also the Russian Federation will see.
We're talking about a capability that only a dozen countries in the world have, and it's certainly a scenario that Russia doesn't ever want to see. These missiles would give Ukraine the ability to attack any point in Russia. They would be difficult to stop, and could have a considerable payload. They would even open the door to the possibility that in a few years, Ukraine could do something like Israel did, produce perfectly operational nuclear weapons in secret. Well, it's known that thanks to the former Soviet aerospace industry in Ukraine, this country has the capacity, know-how, and professionals to produce this technology. What it doesn't have is the money. These types of missiles are very expensive to manufacture, partly because of the technology they are equipped with, and the materials they use to withstand very high temperatures during re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere. And that is why Kyiv is looking for financing. So far, the Biden administration has refused to support them with this program. Instead, they are generously funding the development of the long-range drone program. According to US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, drones are cheaper and more efficient for Ukraine. Of course, they're also less dangerous for Russia and carry less risk of escalation. But of course, the White House did the same thing with the tanks, with the ATACMS and the F-16s. And in the end, it has given the green light to everything. So Moscow doesn't want any surprises. VisualPolitik community, these are the 4 reasons why Moscow has to raise the pressure now, why it's in their interest to raise the temperature, and why Putin has launched this missile designed to carry nuclear warheads and attack anywhere in Europe. In Ukraine, there's no longer only a war over territory, but also a war over the configuration of power relations in the coming decades. There are some analysts who say that all these actions by Putin are nothing more than a bluff, but others point out that Moscow could be very interested in raising the temperature if it doesn't achieve its objectives. And this could even include an attack on NATO territory, as we've told you in this video. But who is right? No one can know for sure. But if one thing is clear, it's that it is in everyone's interest that Putin loses this war one way or another. And Putin's own action in turning up the pressure means that there aren't many alternatives left. Europe's deterrence capabilities must be increased. Ukraine must be armed once the war is over. The Moscow, Pyongyang, Tehran, Beijing axis must be stopped. Yes, this could be tantamount to Putin shooting himself in the foot. But guess what? Even with Trump's win, I personally think that it's something he had already done when he launched his invasion on 24th of February 2022. But having said that, now the questions are for you. How do you think Moscow's provocations should be responded to? Are they really dangerous, or are they just a fast track to turn up the pressure? What would you do, and what do you think Trump will do? Leave us your thoughts in the comments, and as always, let's start a debate. And now, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. All the best, see you next time.